The ballroom was so bright it almost burned. Chandeliers dripped light across marble floors, silver trays floated between tables, and cameras scanned every corner like searchlights. 100 investors in tailored suits leaned back in velvet chairs, sipping wine while waiting for a show. At the center stood a man who owned it all. Ethan Cole, CEO, billionaire, adored by business magazines, feared by his employees. He adjusted his tie, smiled at the crowd, and pointed at a man near the edge of the stage. "You," Cole said, voice amplified by the hall's perfect acoustics. "The farmer in muddy boots. Tell me, do you even know where you are?" Heads turned. Laughter flickered like sparks. The man he pointed to was Daniel Ward, 52 years old, shoulders curved from decades of bending over soil, jacket too big for his frame. His calloused hands hung at his sides, stiff and unsure. He had been invited as part of a so-called community outreach program, a gesture the company liked to showcase in its annual report. Tonight, he was the only one in the room who didn't belong, or at least that's how they wanted him to feel. Ethan Cole gestured to the machine behind him, a piece of equipment covered with a black cloth. "This is the future of agriculture," he announced. "Except, as you can see, it refuses to cooperate." He snapped his fingers. The cloth was pulled away, revealing a sleek metal structure, surrounded by screens, flashing with errors. Murmurs filled the room. Investors leaned forward, their patience wearing thin. Cole smirked and raised his glass. "Our engineers have failed to make it work. But maybe our guest here, the man who still plows his fields by hand, knows something they don't." His words dripped with mockery, sharpened to wound. "Fix this problem, Daniel. Do it in front of all of us. If you succeed, I'll resign tonight." The room erupted in laughter, harsh and echoing. Forks clinked against plates as if applauding the cruelty. Camera lenses zoomed in on Daniel's face, searching for cracks in his composure. Daniel did not move. His chest rose and fell slowly, his eyes fixed on the polished floor that reflected everyone but him. He hadn't spoken yet, but the silence around him was heavier than any words. He was invisible, except when being humiliated for sport. A woman at the nearest table whispered to her companion, loud enough to be heard, "Why bring him here at all? He looks like he wandered in from the street." The companion chuckled, not even bothering to hide it. Cole leaned closer, voice cutting like a knife. "Come on, farmer, show us what you're worth. Or is silence all your kind has to offer?" Every glance was sharp with judgment. Every smirk confirmed what they already believed. Daniel was nothing but a prop, an extra in a play where the rich wrote the script. He was treated as if he didn't exist, yet his humiliation was the night's main entertainment. He tightened his grip on the chair before him. His father's watch pressed cold against his wrist, the only thing of value he wore. He remembered why he had come. The company had promised to buy crops from small farms like his. He hadn't come to be paraded in front of strangers. But now, standing under the lights, his presence had been twisted into a spectacle. An investor shouted from the back, "Give him a chance. Maybe we'll all get a free lesson in farm life." Laughter rolled again, crueler this time. Daniel finally raised his head. His eyes were calm, but the atmosphere crushed in around him. Cameras broadcast his face across the room, and thousands online watched through the company's live stream. He was a man stripped of dignity, standing in a place where he had once been irreplaceable. The same soil he worked fed these people, filled their tables, built the empire Cole claimed as his own. And yet here, in this room, he was reduced to a punchline. It's moments like these that make us wonder how many people carry unrecognized strength. If you've ever seen someone underestimated only to rise in ways nobody expected, I'd love to hear about it. Share your story in the comments, because sometimes the quiet voices hold the most powerful lessons. Cole circled the stage, his shoes clicking against marble like a metronome. "Time is money, Daniel. Investors are waiting. Show us what you've got, or admit you have nothing. Every eye pressed against him, every whisper telling him to give up. He could almost hear the unspoken verdict. He didn't belong here. He never had. And they would erase him the moment the cameras turned away. The air was sharp with perfume, alcohol, and scorn. Waiters glided between tables, careful not to make eye contact. Even the staff had learned what invisibility meant in this place. Daniel stood among them, stripped of voice, reduced to background noise. He thought of his land. The quiet mornings when mist curled over the fields, when every seed carried a promise. He thought of his family, of years of sacrifice that nobody in this hall would ever understand. His presence here wasn't about prestige. It was about survival. But survival came with humiliation, when those with power chose to mock the very people who made their fortunes possible. Cole raised his voice, louder now, reaching every corner of the ballroom. If you want respect here, farmer, earn it. Until then, you're nothing but decoration. The cruelty landed harder than any blow. Guests sipped their wine, nodding along as though it were natural. Cameras captured the smirks, the dismissive gestures, the way no one offered Daniel a seat. He was excluded, erased, made invisible in the very place that claimed to represent progress and inclusion. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer yet. The silence grew unbearable. Some investors began to shift in their seats, restless, wondering what would happen next. For those listening now, if you've ever felt what it means to be overlooked, to stand in a room where nobody sees your worth, know that this story may resonate with you. If you'd like to follow stories that bring these hidden truths into the light, consider staying with this channel. It's where voices like Daniel's are finally heard. Ethan Cole lifted his glass once more, smiling as if the humiliation were a toast. To the future, he declared, where people like him are no longer in the way. The laughter that followed was sharp, cold, and final. The atmosphere in the room left no doubt. Daniel Ward had been written off before he had even spoken a single word. The ballroom emptied slowly after the toast, but the echo of laughter lingered like smoke. Daniel stood near the service exit, waiting for the driver who would return him to the modest hotel room the company had booked. Around him, staff folded tables, stacked glasses, and avoided his eyes. Even in silence, he remained the man singled out for mockery. Outside, the city pressed against him with glass towers, glowing billboards, and endless streams of black cars sliding past. Daniel's jacket felt heavier than usual. He tugged it closer, though the night was warm. The world of Ethan Cole was polished, calculated, and loud. Every surface reflected wealth. Every conversation circled back to profit. Tonight had proved one thing clearly. Men like Daniel were allowed in these places only as decoration, never as equals. In the rural town where Daniel came from, things moved slower. Mornings began with the sound of roosters, not traffic. Meals were eaten at kitchen tables scarred by years of use, not on imported marble. People looked one another in the eye. Life was harsh, but honest. He carried that world in the lines on his face, the dirt that never seemed to wash out from under his nails, the patience carved into him by years of planting and waiting. He had spent 30 years working the same land his father once walked. When storms came, he rebuilt fences. When droughts struck, he rationed water and prayed the crops would hold. Neighbors knew him as steady, reliable, the man who would show up when someone's tractor failed in the middle of harvest. That was who Daniel Ward truly was. And yet, none of it counted here. At the gala, investors had stared through him as though he were part of the wallpaper. Their glances had carried the same unspoken message: you don't belong. He had seen that look before at banks, at city council meetings, even at the grocery store when he paid in small bills. The higher the room, the easier it became for others to erase him. Daniel sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the hum of the air conditioner filling the space. On the nightstand lay a glossy brochure the company had sent weeks earlier. It had promised partnership with local farmers, new opportunities, a future where technology would ease burdens in the field. For men like him, it sounded like survival. His farm's debts were rising. The soil had been unkind the last few seasons. His son was considering leaving for work in the city because there wasn't enough to stay. That brochure had been more than an invitation. It had been a lifeline. But tonight, the lifeline had turned into a noose. Instead of being treated as a partner, he had been dragged into a spectacle. The driver called up from the lobby. Daniel collected his things, his movements slow but steady. He carried no briefcase, no laptop, only a worn leather wallet and a folded photo of his family tucked inside. In the elevator, two young executives whispered about the evening, their laughter bouncing off the mirrored walls. "Did you see his face when Cole called him out?" "Priceless," one said. "He should be grateful," the other replied. Not everyone gets invited to these events. Daniel kept his eyes on the floor numbers, letting their words pass over him like cold rain. He was used to being dismissed, but tonight had stripped away even the small measure of dignity usually left intact. The ride back to the hotel passed through wide streets lined with neon signs. Daniel stared out the window, the city rushing by like a world he could never touch. Every skyscraper seemed to mock him, steel and glass built on money he could never imagine. He thought of the farmhouse waiting for him. Paint peeling, roof patched more times than he could count, but still standing. Inside, his wife kept the place warm. His children, though grown, still returned whenever they could. That house was his world, as solid and fragile as the soil itself. What separated his world from Ethan Cole's was more than money. It was the assumption of worth. Cole believed his presence commanded respect. Daniel was treated as if his presence needed an explanation. Back at the farm, life had its own rhythm. Before dawn, Daniel would walk the fields, boots sinking into damp earth. He would pause, studying the rows of crops, listening to the quiet signs the land offered. Those mornings, he felt irreplaceable. The farm existed because he refused to let it fail. He patched, fixed, carried, and endured. No investor could measure that kind of work, yet it was the backbone of everything they claimed to innovate. In the ballroom, he had been excluded. At home, he was essential. The divide between those two worlds was so wide it seemed impossible to cross. And yet, fate had placed him at the edge of both. Daniel's reflection in the hotel mirror looked older tonight. Lines ran deeper, eyes more tired. But under the weariness was something harder: resolve. He didn't crave luxury or applause. All he wanted was recognition that his life, his work, his worth mattered. That night, as he turned off the light, he knew the divide would not close on its own. It would take something extraordinary, something undeniable, for people like Ethan Cole to see beyond their own reflection. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel felt the stirrings of that moment approaching. The next morning, long before the city stirred, Daniel woke with the habits of a man shaped by land and routine. His body carried the rhythm of decades. Rise early, move steady, endure. He stepped outside the small hotel, breathing air heavy with exhaust. But his mind drifted far from concrete. He thought of home. Home was not a place of chandeliers or marble floors. It was a patch of earth his family had defended against debt and weather for 3 generations. His earliest memories were of his father's hands, rough from labor, guiding his small fingers to plant seeds in soil that seemed endless to a child. His father, Thomas Ward, spoke little but carried authority that came from living close to the land. "Pay attention," Thomas would say, voice calm, steady. "The land will tell you what it needs. Don't fight it. Listen." Those words followed Daniel through childhood. He learned to notice the small things: the tilt of a leaf, the weight of a cloud, the way animals grew restless before a storm, knowledge that didn't come from books, but from constant watching. His father trusted what he could see and touch, and that trust never failed him. Life on the farm was not easy. Summers burned crops to dust. Winters froze pipes until mornings began with hammering ice. When neighbors needed help, Thomas loaded tools in the truck without question. Daniel rode beside him, absorbing every quiet lesson. Dignity was not in wealth, but in showing up when no one else would. There was one night Daniel never forgot. He was 12 when a storm tore across the valley, ripping roofs, flooding fields. Electricity went out for 3 days. While neighbors panicked, his father moved with calm certainty, setting lanterns, dividing food, walking miles to check on the elderly couple down the road. That storm carved something into Daniel's memory. Strength was not loud. It was steady. Years later, when Thomas died after a long illness, the farm nearly collapsed under the weight of medical bills. Daniel, barely 20, dropped any thought of leaving. He became the caretaker of land, family, and memory. His mother wept at the kitchen table, afraid they would lose everything. Daniel promised her they wouldn't. It was the first time he had to wear his father's voice, calm, steady, unyielding. Through his 20s and 30s, Daniel rebuilt fences, sold equipment, borrowed carefully, and worked nights hauling grain for others to keep the farm alive. He married Claire, a woman who carried patience in her eyes and strength in her silence. Together they raised 2 children, Matthew and Grace, in that old farmhouse. He wanted them to see what he had seen. That worth was not in applause but in persistence. There were moments of quiet pride. When Matthew learned to drive the tractor at 14, Daniel felt the same pride his father once carried. When Grace won a school prize, Daniel hung the certificate on the wall, though the frame cost more than he could spare. These small triumphs meant more than numbers in a bank account. But sacrifice carved deep lines. There were years when crops failed. When he sold tools he had repaired a dozen times just to pay for fuel. He worked jobs off the farm fixing fences for neighbors, unloading trucks in town, and returned home after midnight to check irrigation by flashlight. Claire waited with coffee, never complaining, only saying, "You did what you could." In all of it, Daniel carried his father's voice. Listen. Don't fight what you can't control. Endure. That voice returned often, especially when outsiders questioned his worth. At council meetings, when developers mocked small farmers as outdated, Daniel felt his father's hand on his shoulder. At banks, when clerks spoke slowly as though he couldn't understand, Daniel remembered storms survived and promises kept. His children grew, but the farm remained the center of his world. It was both anchor and burden. He had dreamed once of expansion, maybe new equipment, maybe more land. Those dreams narrowed into survival. But survival itself was a victory. By the time the company invited him to their program, Daniel had already spent years walking the thin line between hope and collapse. The letter carried words like innovation, partnership, and opportunity. For once, he allowed himself to believe someone saw value in what he had guarded all his life. That belief carried him to the ballroom, into the hands of Ethan Cole. What Cole dismissed with a smile had been decades of resilience, sacrifice, and silent victories. Daniel stood in that room not as a token, but as the last thread of a legacy. If Cole had known the storms Daniel had endured, the nights he worked until dawn to keep soil alive, the weight of promises he carried for his family, perhaps the cruelty would have landed differently. But Cole didn't know. He didn't want to know. To him, Daniel was just a man in worn boots, easy to mock, easy to erase. What Cole failed to understand was that men like Daniel were never defined by applause. They were defined by survival, by the invisible weight of keeping others fed. The world had taught Daniel to endure humiliation in silence, but silence was never weakness. It was a form of strength. a strength he carried from his father, a strength that had not yet been tested in Cole's world of glass and steel. That legacy was about to matter more than anyone in that ballroom imagined. The following evening, the company staged another event, this time in its headquarters auditorium. Rows of seats filled quickly with employees, partners, and reporters. At the front, cameras mounted on tripods streamed every second to thousands watching online. Daniel had been told to attend again, though no one explained why. He arrived wearing the same jacket, worn at the elbows, carrying the weight of someone who knew too well he was out of place. Ethan Cole stood at the podium, smiling as though nothing from the gala had been cruel. His voice carried the easy confidence of a man who never expected to be challenged. "Ladies and gentlemen, last night we had a little experiment," he said, pausing for the expected laughter. "Our guest, Mr. Ward, was asked to help us with a small issue. The audience seemed to enjoy it. Reporters chuckled politely. Cole leaned forward, his tone sharpening. Tonight, I've decided to give him another chance. After all, transparency matters. Let the world see what happens when tradition meets innovation." Daniel felt every eye shift toward him. The auditorium lights cut across his face, too bright, too sharp. He sat alone in the second row, the seat beside him empty though the hall was full. Cole gestured toward him. "Mr. Ward, please join me on stage," the crowd murmured. Phones lifted, already recording. Daniel rose slowly, walking the long aisle, while whispers rippled around him. He caught fragments. "This should be good. Poor guy, doesn't even realize. Why embarrass him again?" When he reached the stage, Cole placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling at the cameras. The grip was firm, controlling. "Our farmers feed the world," Cole said, voice dripping with insincere respect. "But the world is changing. Machines, systems, efficiency. Some people can keep up, others cannot." He released Daniel's shoulder, letting silence hang. "Tonight, let's find out which category Mr. Ward belongs to." The crowd leaned forward. A large screen displayed graphs and flashing warnings. Though no explanation was given, Cole raised his voice. "Here is the challenge. If this man can resolve the problem before us, I will step down as I promised. If not, I expect silence from those who still believe hard work alone can compete with innovation." The words cut sharp. The audience buzzed. Reporters typed furiously, ready to frame the story as either spectacle or humiliation. Daniel stood motionless. He had not asked for this stage, nor this trial, but backing away would mean proving them right that he was nothing more than decoration, a man to be pitied. Cole turned to him, voice cold. "Do you accept? Or would you rather return to your fields?" The question was designed to corner him. Either choice left him diminished. Around the hall, faces waited, expecting either refusal or failure. Even the employees shifted uneasily, knowing what this meant. One man's humiliation was about to become company entertainment. Daniel lifted his head. His voice was steady, though quiet. "I'll try." A stir ran through the hall. Cole smiled, satisfied. "Excellent. Then let's begin." He gestured to the equipment at center stage, symbols flashing across the display. Daniel stepped closer. He felt the gaze of hundreds burning into his back. He could hear whispers, the faint click of cameras, the soft laughter of those convinced this was a waste of time. His presence was tolerated only because it amused them. He thought of his children. He remembered the nights when he had walked the fields alone, knowing failure meant more than personal pride. It meant hunger, debt, losing the last piece of land his father had left him. He remembered the promises whispered to Claire in the dark. "I'll keep us afloat, no matter what it takes." That memory steadied him now. Cole crossed his arms, watching with a smirk. "Let's see what a farmer's touch can do." His tone was sharp, every word meant to wound. The crowd waited, a mixture of curiosity and cruelty. For them, it was a performance. For Daniel, it was survival, dressed up as a spectacle. The hall was quiet except for the hum of machines and the faint shuffle of feet. Daniel stood in front of the equipment, its surface polished, its display filled with signals no one bothered to explain. He didn't need explanations. He had spent a lifetime learning how to notice what others ignored. He placed his hand on the frame. The metal was warm, trembling slightly. He listened not with his ears alone, but with the patience carved into him from years in the field. To everyone else, this was a lifeless structure, expensive and uncooperative. To him, it was something struggling to work, but being pushed in the wrong way. Whispers spread behind him. He has no idea what he's looking at. This is embarrassing. Ethan Cole raised his voice. Well, Mr. Ward, have you figured out how to grow corn with it yet? The laughter was sharp, immediate. Daniel ignored him. He crouched, studying the way the parts connected, the way the system strained as though fighting itself. It reminded him of seasons when the soil was overworked, when pushing harder only killed what little strength remained. Sometimes the answer wasn't force. It was balance. He adjusted a simple setting, not a technical action, but something visible and ordinary, a correction anyone could have tried if they had been willing to look closely. He straightened and spoke quietly, almost to himself. You've been trying to make it do something it wasn't meant to do. The display flickered. A sound shifted, softer, steadier. The audience stirred. Cole frowned, his smile faltering for the first time. Coincidence, he said quickly. It won't last. But it did. The lights on the panel stabilized, glowing a steady green. The tremble in the frame eased. Reporters leaned forward, phones rising higher. Daniel stepped back, hands at his sides. He hadn't shouted, hadn't boasted. He had simply noticed what no one else had cared to see. Years of living with the land had taught him that problems spoke in quiet signs. Tonight, those signs had spoken here too. The crowd shifted from mockery to silence. A man in the third row whispered, "It's working." The words spread, repeated, until the hall buzzed with disbelief. Cole's jaw tightened. He turned toward the investors in the front row, searching for support. But their eyes were fixed on Daniel. They had watched teams of specialists fail for weeks. And now, in minutes, a man they had dismissed as irrelevant had revealed what none of them had grasped. One investor rose from his seat. "Do it again," he said firmly. "Show us it wasn't luck." Daniel nodded once. He repeated the adjustment, slower this time, letting them see. Again, the system steadied. Again, the trembling eased. The pattern was undeniable. Applause broke from somewhere in the back, hesitant at first, then louder. Reporters typed furiously, cameras flashing. What had begun as entertainment now looked like a turning point. Cole raised his hand, forcing the room quiet. His voice was cold, stripped of charm. "Don't be deceived. This doesn't mean he understands. Anyone can stumble on a trick." But the investors were no longer listening to him. They whispered among themselves, nodding toward Daniel, their expressions shifting from skepticism to curiosity. For them, this wasn't about prestige. It was about results. And results were standing right in front of them, in worn boots and a borrowed jacket. Daniel stood still, letting the room absorb what had happened. He had not begged for respect. He had not fought for attention. He had simply done what he always did. Observe, endure, and act with quiet certainty. For the first time since he stepped into this world of glass and steel, the weight pressing down on him shifted. The eyes that once erased him now studied him with reluctant respect. The silence was no longer humiliating. It was waiting. He met Cole's stare, calm and steady. "You said if I fixed it, you would resign." His voice was not raised, but it cut through the hall like a blade. Gasps filled the air. Cameras zoomed closer. For the first time, Ethan Cole had no answer. The silence in the auditorium stretched thin. Daniel's words lingered in the air, impossible to ignore. "You said, if I fixed it, you would resign." Ethan Cole adjusted his tie, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't twist my words. This was a demonstration, nothing more." But the room had heard him. The live stream had captured every syllable. Reporters replayed the clip on their screens, some already typing headlines. "CEO's promise backfires." An investor in the front row stood. His voice was firm, cutting through the uneasy murmur. "Mr. Cole, you made a public commitment. Are you now suggesting your word means nothing?" Others followed. "We've lost weeks watching this failure," another said. "This man fixed it in minutes. That deserves acknowledgement." The crowd shifted, their whispers turning sharp. Employees who had once looked away now leaned forward. Their expressions changed. The power in the room was no longer Cole's alone. Daniel remained still, his hands at his sides. He hadn't moved since he spoke, but the weight of the room had moved around him. He wasn't invisible anymore. Cole's voice hardened, stripped of charm. "You think one lucky adjustment qualifies him to stand here? He has no degree, no background. He doesn't belong in this conversation." The words landed heavy, but this time they did not draw laughter. Instead, they drew silence, the silence of an audience no longer willing to play along. Daniel met his stare. His reply was calm, almost quiet, but it carried. "Respect isn't earned with papers or titles. It's earned by results." Applause broke, not polite but firm, echoing off the high walls. Investors exchanged looks, some nodding. Cole's jaw tightened. He turned to the board members, seated at the side. "You know this is absurd. You cannot seriously consider." But one of them, a woman who had been silent all evening, rose. "What's absurd is that you mocked a man in front of your company, and he succeeded where your teams failed. We saw it. The world saw it. The issue isn't him. The issue is you." Gasps rippled through the hall. Reporters scrambled to catch every word. Cole's mask slipped. Anger flared in his eyes. But anger could not rewrite what everyone had witnessed. Another board member added, "Trust is the currency of leadership. Tonight, you spent it carelessly." Cole tried to speak, but the words tangled. The more he denied, the more the room shifted away from him. The live stream comments were ruthless. "Hold him to his word. Step down. Farmer wins." Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The moment itself carried all the weight. He had stood in this very place as a prop for humiliation. But now, the balance had turned. Every eye that once dismissed him now measured him differently. The lead investor rose again. "Mr. Cole, you promised. And a promise made in public is not decoration. It's binding." Cole's face drained of color. His hand gripped the podium, knuckles white. For the first time, his voice faltered. "This is a misunderstanding." But the board cut him off. "Enough. The company cannot afford leadership that treats commitments like jokes. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending review." The room erupted. Reporters surged forward. Cameras caught every angle. The man once untouchable now cornered by his own arrogance. Cole's shoulders stiffened, but he had no ground left. The investors turned away from him, their focus shifting to Daniel. The contrast was stark. One man stripped of authority, the other finally seen for what he carried. An employee stepped forward, voice shaking but clear. "Mr. Ward, you reminded us why we started this work." "Thank you." Daniel gave a small nod. He wasn't used to applause, but tonight it came not for spectacle, but for recognition. Cole was led from the stage, his protest drowned by the noise of cameras and voices. The image spread instantly across screens. A CEO who mocked a farmer, and a farmer who answered not with anger, but with proof. For years Daniel had been treated as invisible, erased in rooms like this. Tonight the reckoning was public, and it was just. When the noise of the auditorium faded, the images had already spread further than anyone inside the building could imagine. Clips flooded social media, the farmer fixing what others could not, the CEO refusing his own words, the board stripping him of authority. By the next morning, headlines carried the story across every major outlet. Some called it a reckoning, others called it justice. Daniel did not stay to celebrate. He returned to his hotel room, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the silence wash over him. He wasn't a man accustomed to applause. His satisfaction came from quieter victories, a harvest completed, a debt paid, a promise kept. Tonight had been different. Tonight the world had been forced to see him. 2 days later, the company reached out again. Not with another staged event, not with empty promises, but with an offer. The board wanted him to serve as an advisor, a bridge between the technology they designed and the farmers who would actually live with it. The position came with pay, recognition, and a voice. Daniel hesitated. He had never asked for a title, never sought a seat in conference rooms, but he thought of his children, of the years spent being spoken over, of the small farmers who rarely had anyone to defend their worth. Accepting meant more than personal gain. It meant opening a door others like him had always found closed. He accepted. Weeks passed. When he walked into company offices now, heads turned not with mockery, but with respect. Some employees greeted him quietly, thanking him for reminding them why they had chosen this work. Investors sought his opinion. Journalists requested interviews, but Daniel never let the attention distort him. He spoke simply, answered directly, and returned home after every trip. Back at the farm, life continued with the same rhythm. Dawn still came early. The soil still demanded patience. Daniel still walked the fields with steady steps, boots sinking into the earth. The difference was that now, when he returned inside, his children looked at him with new pride. His son Matthew no longer spoke about leaving. Instead, he asked about joining him in the fields. Grace told her classmates about her father. Not with hesitation, but with confidence. Claire watched all of it quietly, her smile carrying years of unspoken faith finally recognized. The former CEO's name still appeared in the news, mostly in connection with his downfall. Some debated whether the board had acted too harshly. Others said it was overdue. For Daniel, it didn't matter. The arrogance that once towered over him had been reduced to a lesson. The man who had mocked him became an example of what happens when power forgets humility. Months later, Daniel stood in front of a new assembly hall filled with both executives and farmers. He spoke without notes, his voice calm. Progress means nothing if it forgets the people who carry it. Machines can't plant trust. Technology can't replace respect. If you want the future to last, build it with the people who know the ground beneath your feet. The applause that followed was not for spectacle, not for entertainment, but for truth, spoken plainly. Back home, Daniel hung his father's watch on a nail above the kitchen doorway. It had ticked through storms, harvests, debts, and disappointments. Now it hung as a reminder that dignity can survive mockery, that silence can outlast cruelty, and that promises made in arrogance can become the stage for justice. The land remained the same, crops still bent with the wind. But Daniel's place in the world had changed. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer decoration in someone else's story. He was proof that respect, once denied, can be reclaimed. And though the lights and cameras had moved on, the legacy remained. Not the legacy of a company or a CEO, but the legacy of a farmer who stood in a room designed to erase him and left it with every eye forced to see him.